In 1970, a man walked into the Israeli embassy in London and asked for something no defector before him had ever dared to request: a direct line to the head of Mossad himself. He did not look like a man in danger. He wore a tailored suit. He spoke with the ease of someone who had never once been told to wait his turn. His name was Ashraf Marwan, and he was the son-in-law of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president who had shaped modern Egypt and humiliated Israel 3 years earlier in 6 days of war. He was about to offer to spy against his own family. Something for you before we go further, since you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. Our limited edition ebook covers how controlled betrayal operations are actually built and run, the recruitment signals, the false alarm techniques used to condition a target's trust, and the long-term costs those methods carry. Scan the QR code on the screen to grab your copy, or click the link in the description. Then stay with us. This story is just getting started. There is a rule that every intelligence officer learns early, and it is this: the source who arrives too easily is usually the most dangerous one to trust. Real agents are built over years, cultivated through patience, tested through small betrayals before they are ever handed anything that matters. Marwan skipped every step. He simply appeared, offered access to the innermost workings of the Egyptian state, and asked what it was worth. The embassy staff who took the first meeting were not the ones who would decide anything. Their job was smaller and stranger than that: to sit across from a man claiming to be someone he almost certainly was, and to work out, in the space of a single conversation, whether that claim was the beginning of an intelligence windfall or the opening move of a trap they would not recognize until it was too late to undo. The men who met him that day carried two competing instincts, and neither one would fully go away for the next 37 years. The first instinct said this was an opportunity too extraordinary to walk away from. The second said that anything this valuable, offered this freely by a man this close to power, might not be an opportunity at all. It might be bait. Marwan did not behave like a man selling out his country for money, though the money that would eventually pass through his hands was enormous. He behaved like a man who had already made a decision and was simply informing Israel of the terms. He handed over documents, real ones, classified ones. The kind of material that does not come from ambition or imagination, but from a desk inside a government most foreign services could never reach. The men reviewing what he brought found no fabrication, no filler, nothing that read like a performance built to impress. What they found instead was the sensation every case officer dreads and craves in equal measure: the feeling of being handed something too good, from someone they could not yet fully explain. There was, in those early weeks, a quiet vetting process that outsiders rarely hear about. Analysts cross-checked what Marwan provided against what was already known through other channels, looking for the small inconsistencies that usually give a plant away: a detail slightly too convenient, a document slightly too clean. They found none. Whether that meant Marwan was exactly what he claimed to be, or that whoever had built this operation had simply anticipated the test and passed it deliberately, was a question nobody in that room could settle with the information they had. By December of that year, Marwan was on the books as a paid Mossad asset, run under a code name that would follow him for the rest of his life: the Angel. But a code name is not a cover, and a cover is not a life. What Marwan needed now was something far harder to construct than a false passport or a rehearsed alibi. He needed an entire existence that could hold up to daily scrutiny from people who loved him, worked beside him, and had known him since he was a boy standing next to Nasser in old photographs at the palace. He was not infiltrating a hostile country as a stranger. He was betraying the one place on earth where he was already fully known. That distinction changes everything about how a deception has to be built. A stranger can vanish into a new identity. A son-in-law cannot vanish. He has to keep showing up to the same dinners, the same meetings, the same rooms full of people who would recognize the smallest shift in his behavior before they could even name what had changed. The first unresolved risk sat inside that fact, and never left. Marwan's access came entirely from his position inside Sadat's circle. The moment anyone in that circle began to doubt him, the access disappeared, and so, most likely, did he. That risk did not stop at Marwan himself. His wife was Nasser's own daughter, carrying a name that made her, whether she knew anything or not, permanently tied to whatever her husband turned out to be. A man in Marwan's position was not simply gambling with his own life. He was gambling with a family whose name was inseparable from the government he was betraying, and there was no version of exposure that would have left them untouched by it. The second risk was quieter, and in some ways worse. Israel did not fully know what it had. Was Marwan volunteering because he had turned against his own government, for reasons of conviction or grievance nobody outside his own mind could verify? Or had he been sent, deliberately placed inside Israeli intelligence by people in Cairo who understood exactly how valuable a trusted insider could become, precisely because he seemed too valuable to question? Nobody in that London meeting could answer that question with certainty. Nobody would be able to answer it with certainty decades later, either. What both sides agreed on, at least for now, was that the arrangement would continue. Marwan would travel. He would meet his handlers quietly, across European cities, folding these meetings into a life that already involved constant travel for business. He would bring back documents, assessments, warnings, and the particular currency that made him irreplaceable. The internal thinking of men who believed they were speaking freely because no one in the room was supposed to be listening. There is a cost buried inside every arrangement like this one, and it does not announce itself at the beginning. It accumulates. Every meeting that goes well makes the next one feel safer than it actually is. Every year that passes without exposure quietly raises the price of what exposure would eventually mean, not just to Marwan, but to everyone who had trusted him along the way. For now, none of that had come due. Marwan returned to Cairo. He returned to Sadat's inner circle, to boardrooms, to family gatherings where Nasser's name still hung over every conversation like a weather system nobody could escape. He returned, in other words, to being exactly who everyone already believed him to be. Except for one detail that only a handful of people on Earth were aware of, and that detail was enough to make every ordinary moment of his life a small act of performance. A conversation about business became a cover story. A trip abroad became an alibi rehearsed so many times it no longer felt rehearsed at all. A dinner with colleagues became a test he did not know he was taking, every single time. Inside Egypt, Marwan did not answer to Sadat alone. His movements and his standing were also shaped by Sami Sharif, the chief of staff who supervised him under both Nasser and Sadat, a man whose approval mattered as much to Marwan's position as the president's own trust did. Every meeting Marwan attended, every assignment he was given, ran through a structure Sharif helped control. That structure gave Marwan real work to hide behind, and real work is the best cover a source can ever have. He was not inventing reasons to travel. He was already the kind of man whose business took him to London, to Geneva, to rooms full of financiers who had no idea what else he carried out of those cities. Somewhere in Cairo, in the offices of Egyptian intelligence, officers whose entire job was to notice exactly this kind of anomaly were going about their work, reviewing travel patterns, watching for inconsistencies, doing what counterintelligence services exist to do. They had not flagged Marwan. Not yet. Whether that was because there was nothing to flag, or because the deception was simply better than anything they had trained to catch, was a question none of them could have answered at the time, and it raises the one question that would follow Ashraf Marwan for the rest of his life. Long after the meetings in London, long after the money, long after the war that had not yet come. If a man this close to power could deceive one of the most storied intelligence agencies in the world for years without detection, what made anyone certain, on either side, about who was actually deceiving whom? 2 years passed, and the arrangement that had begun in a London embassy became something closer to a marriage than a transaction, full of routine, full of dependency, and full of the kind of trust that only builds when nothing has yet gone wrong. Marwan's reporting had become, by 1971, the backbone of how Israeli intelligence understood Egyptian intentions. Assessments were built around what he said. Military postures were adjusted based on his warnings. An assumption had quietly taken hold inside the upper levels of Israeli intelligence, and it was this, that the angel's access made him not just valuable, but reliable in a way few sources ever became. That assumption was about to be tested, and not gently. In the spring of that year, Marwan warned that Egypt was preparing for war. The warning was specific enough to matter and urgent enough to act on. Israel responded the way any serious intelligence service responds to a credible threat from its best source, with mobilization, with cost, with disruption to an economy that could not easily absorb the strain of calling up reservists on short notice. The war did not come. Nothing happened. No crossing, no offensive, no confirmation that the warning had ever reflected anything more than a plan that changed, or a moment that passed, or an assessment that simply turned out to be wrong. Marwan offered an explanation, and the explanation was accepted, because rejecting it meant confronting a possibility nobody wanted to sit with yet. Then it happened again. A second warning, a second mobilization, a second silence where an attack was supposed to be. 2 false alarms from a single source is not, on its own, proof of anything. Plans change. Governments hesitate. Wars that seem imminent one month can dissolve into diplomacy the next, for reasons that have nothing to do with deception and everything to do with the ordinary unpredictability of political decision-making. But inside Israeli military intelligence, a fracture was beginning to form, and it ran along a line that would never fully close. On one side stood the people who had built their careers and their judgment around trusting the angel completely. On the other stood a smaller, quieter group who had begun to ask a question that could not be unasked once it existed. What if the false alarms were not mistakes? What if they were training? The theory was simple enough to be unsettling. An intelligence service that mobilizes twice for wars that never come will be slower, more skeptical, and more exhausted the third time a warning arrives, even if the third warning happens to be true. If someone wanted Israel to lower its guard at precisely the moment it needed it most, there was no more elegant way to do it than to let its most trusted source cry wolf twice, at enormous cost, and let institutional fatigue do the rest of the work. Nobody could prove this. That was the problem. The theory fit the facts perfectly, but so did the simpler explanation. That wars are difficult to predict, plans shift constantly inside authoritarian governments, and 2 wrong calls did not make a man a traitor. The doubt did not stay contained to quiet conversations in hallways. It reached the level where decisions got made about whether to continue relying on Marwan at all. There was a meeting, the kind that rarely gets written down in detail, because everyone in the room understands that some conversations are more dangerous on paper than they are out loud. The question on the table was not abstract. It was operational, immediate, and impossible to answer with confidence. Do we continue treating this source as reliable? Do we scale back what we act on while continuing to collect what he offers? Or do we cut him loose entirely and accept the loss of the best access anyone in this room has ever had into the Egyptian government? Cutting him loose was not a small decision. It meant losing years of built relationship, losing whatever genuine value his reporting had provided, and losing it based on a theory that could not be confirmed either way. It also meant, if the theory was wrong, walking away from a source who might still deliver the single most important warning Israel would ever receive. Keeping him active carried the opposite risk. If the theory was right, every future report from Marwan was not intelligence at all. It was material selected and shaped by someone else, delivered through a channel that had been built specifically to be believed. No clean decision existed. What existed instead was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Marwan would continue to be run, continue to be paid, continue to be treated as an asset of extraordinary value, while a smaller and more skeptical faction inside Israeli intelligence quietly discounted everything he said, waiting to see which version of him would eventually reveal itself. This is the point where an assumption from earlier in the story has to be set aside entirely. It had seemed, at the beginning, that Marwan's danger came from the outside, from Egyptian counterintelligence discovering what he was doing and ending his life the way these stories usually end. That danger was real. It had never gone away. But a second danger had quietly grown alongside it. One that had nothing to do with Cairo at all. The people Marwan was risking his life to serve, the people he had trusted with his identity and his secrets since 1970, no longer fully trusted him back. He was, without necessarily knowing the details, being watched from inside the very organization he believed was protecting him. And here the story turns on something almost nobody involved could have anticipated at the time. If Marwan was loyal, if the false alarms really were the ordinary friction of trying to predict an unpredictable government, then the deepening suspicion inside Israeli intelligence was itself a kind of quiet betrayal. A man risking everything, delivering real warnings that happened to be wrong through no fault of his own, was being treated as a possible traitor by the very people whose lives his information was meant to protect. But if Marwan was not loyal, if the theory being whispered in those closed-door meetings was correct, then something far stranger was true. The people who doubted him were not paranoid. They were right. And the very fact that they could not prove it, that their suspicion was overruled by years of accumulated trust and by the sheer value of what Marwan continued to provide, meant the deception was working exactly as it was designed to work. Not by fooling everyone, just by fooling enough of the right people, at the right moments, for long enough. Either version left the same uncomfortable fact standing in the middle of the room. The angel's information was still being used. Assessments were still being built on it. And nobody, not the officers who trusted him completely, not the smaller group who had begun to doubt him, not Marwan himself, wherever his true loyalty actually sat, could say with certainty which version of this operation they were actually living inside. What made the fractures so difficult to resolve was that both sides were arguing from the same evidence and reaching opposite conclusions about what it meant. The believers pointed to years of documented, verifiable material that had never once been proven false, actual policy papers, actual troop assessments, information that Egypt would never have willingly handed over if the goal had simply been deception. The skeptics pointed to something harder to quantify, a pattern, a feeling. The sense that a man this valuable, offering himself this easily, fit the profile of a plant too well to dismiss on faith alone. The false alarms faded into the background of daily intelligence work, filed away as unresolved anomalies rather than answered questions. Marwan kept traveling. He kept meeting his handlers. He kept returning to Cairo, to Sadat's circle, to a life that from the outside looked exactly as it always had. But something had shifted, quietly and permanently, in how he was being received on the other end of every report he sent. A door that had once opened without hesitation now opened more slowly, weighed each time against a question nobody wanted to say out loud. Was this the truth? Or was this the version of the truth someone wanted Israel to believe? Inside that stretch of unresolved doubt, Marwan's position inside Egypt only grew stronger, which made the uncertainty around him even harder to sit with. He was not a peripheral aide anyone could quietly sideline. He was becoming one of Sadat's trusted men during a period when Sadat was consolidating power against rivals inside his own government. A period when loyalty was tested constantly and measured carefully. That meant every additional year Marwan survived inside Sadat's circle without suspicion was also another year in which, if he had been Egypt's instrument from the very start, his position to shape what Israel believed only deepened. Trust, on both sides, was compounding in a way that made the eventual reckoning heavier the longer it was delayed. By the autumn of 1973, the doubt that had settled over Marwan's reporting had not resolved. It had simply become part of the routine, the way a persistent ache becomes part of how a body moves without ever fully announcing itself. Then, in the first days of October, the pattern started again, and this time it started differently. fragments arrived first. A troop movement here, a supply consolidation there, nothing that on its own justified alarm, but together forming the shape of something Israeli intelligence had seen twice before and been burned by twice before. The instinct across much of the intelligence establishment was not urgency. It was fatigue dressed up as caution. This had happened already. Twice, mobilization was expensive, politically costly, and by now carried the quiet stigma of having been wrong before. The assumption forming inside the rooms where these decisions got made was simple and, in hindsight, catastrophic, that Egyptian military activity near the frontier was posturing, or routine exercise, or at most a repeat of the false alarms that had already cost the country enough. Marwan was in London that week, attending to the version of his life that required no explanation to anyone: meetings, business interests, the ordinary motion of a wealthy man's calendar. He was not near Cairo. He was not in the rooms where the real decisions were being finalized. What he had instead was a set of signals, gathered from conversations and observations that on any other week might have meant nothing at all. He requested contact with his handlers. Not the routine kind, the urgent kind, the kind that skips the usual channels and goes straight to people who do not like being interrupted without cause. The first response was hesitation. There is a particular kind of paralysis that sets in after a source has been wrong before, and it does not look like disbelief. It looks like process. Handlers wanting to confirm through the ordinary channel rather than the emergency one. Officers wanting a clearer picture before elevating anything to the people who would have to act on it. Nobody explicitly said they doubted Marwan. What they did instead was slow down, and slowing down, in a window measured in hours, is its own kind of decision. Marwan pushed harder than he ever had. He was not asking for a meeting through the normal protocol. He was demanding direct contact with Zvi Zamir, the head of Mossad himself, a request that under ordinary circumstances would have been almost unthinkable to grant on short notice, and which under these circumstances still took long enough to arrange that every hour of delay became its own quiet cost. Somewhere inside that gap, the incorrect assumption that had been building since the false alarms of 1971 and 72 played out exactly as its own internal logic predicted it would. Analysts working the Egyptian file looked at troop concentrations along the canal and read them, initially as defensive posturing tied to ongoing tension rather than preparation for an imminent offensive. It was not stupidity. It was pattern matching against everything that had happened the last two times this exact picture had appeared and turned out to mean nothing. The false start came in the form of a partial alert, a limited mobilization order, cautious rather than full, reflecting a leadership still not fully convinced that this time was different from the last two. It was the institutional equivalent of a held breath, enough movement to say something was being taken seriously. Not enough to say anyone believed, yet, that war was truly hours away. And then came the moment that came closest to undoing everything. In the process of arranging emergency contact, a question was raised inside Israeli intelligence that had never fully gone away since 1971. Whether escalating based on Marwan's information again, a third time, risked repeating a mistake that had already cost credibility and resources twice before. There were people in that chain of decision-making who argued, not unreasonably, for restraint, for waiting on confirmation through other channels, for treating this like the two alarms that preceded it, rather than assuming immediately that this one was real. This was the near abort. Not a formal decision to ignore Marwan entirely, but a real and serious pull toward treating his urgency as one more version of a pattern that had already proven unreliable. Had that argument won out fully, had the caution of the previous two false alarms been allowed to govern the response to this one, the gap between warning and attack would have closed even further than it already had. Those arguing for caution were not wrong to be careful. That was what made the disagreement so difficult to resolve inside the room. They had watched the country pay a real economic and political price twice already for trusting this same channel, and nothing about the fragments arriving that week proved, on their own, that this time was different. The people urging urgency had no better evidence than the people urging restraint, only a stronger instinct, and less patience for being wrong a third time in the other direction. It did not win out completely, but it delayed things enough that by the time Marwan finally secured his meeting with Zamir, the margin for action had narrowed to something close to its absolute minimum. The meeting itself, when it happened, carried none of the ceremony that this kind of moment might suggest. Marwan delivered what he had, that the attack was coming, that it was coming soon, framed in terms specific enough to be actionable and urgent enough to finally cut through the institutional hesitation that had slowed everything up to that point. For a brief window afterward, there was something that felt, to some in the room, like relief. Confirmation, finally, after years of uncertainty about what this source actually was. A clear warning, delivered directly, at enormous personal risk, by a man who did not have to make that call at all. That relief did not last long, and it should not have lasted as long as it did. Because even with the warning delivered, even with Zamir himself now aware, the machinery required to translate a warning into a defense does not move instantly. Orders have to travel down a chain of command. Reservists have to be notified, and notification takes time. Equipment has to move. The 14 or so hours between Marwan's warning and the actual opening of the war were nowhere near enough to complete the kind of full mobilization that might have blunted the initial attack entirely. There was, in other words, a false sense of resolution sitting inside that meeting with Zamir, a feeling that the hardest part was now over, that the warning had been received and believed, and that the response would follow naturally. What actually followed was a scramble against a clock that had already run down far further than anyone directly responsible for Israel's defense would have chosen, if the choice had ever truly been theirs to make cleanly. Whether that narrow margin existed because Marwan himself had waited, deliberately or not, until the last possible moment to deliver what he knew, or because the truth had simply reached him late, exactly as he claimed, was a question that the hours before the war gave nobody time to ask, and the decades afterward would never fully answer. What was certain, in the moment itself, was only this. A warning had been given. It had been believed, at least by the man empowered to act on it. And whether that combination would be enough was a question the next several hours were about to answer in a way that could not be undone, revised, or explained away afterward, no matter which version of Ashraf Marwan turned out, eventually, to be the true one. The war that began within hours of Marwan's warning did not end the way anyone in that room with Zamir had hoped it would when the meeting concluded. Israel survived the opening assault, but survived it wounded. The narrow margin between warning and attack meant that reservists were still moving into position as the first shells landed. Positions along the canal that a fuller mobilization might have held were overrun in the war's opening hours. The cost of those first days would be counted for years afterward, not just in the casualty figures, but in the harder question that followed every survivor of that opening assault home. Could this have gone differently, if the warning had come sooner? That question could not be separated from everything that came before it. The two false alarms in 1971 and 1972 had not simply been forgotten once the real attack came. They had shaped the response to it. The hesitation inside Israeli intelligence during the first days of October. The argument for treating Marwan's urgency as one more repeat of a pattern rather than the real thing. The partial mobilization instead of the full one. All of it traced directly back to a credibility problem that had been building for 2 years before the war ever began. This is the part of the story that resists a clean verdict, and it resisted one for decades. If Marwan was loyal, then the 14-hour warning was not a failure of trust. It was the truth arriving exactly as fast as a source without perfect access to Egyptian military timing could have delivered it. And the true failure belonged to an intelligence apparatus that had grown too cautious, too slow to act, after being burned twice by warnings that turned out to be wrong through no fault of the man who gave them. If Marwan was not loyal, then the same 14 hours told an entirely different story. A warning delayed just long enough to look heroic while giving Egypt the opening it needed. Two false alarms that were never mistakes at all, but the long, patient construction of exactly the kind of institutional fatigue that would make the real warning, when it finally came, arrive too late to fully matter. Both versions of this story were argued, seriously and at length, by people who had access to the same files and reached opposite conclusions. Zvi Samir, who had taken personal responsibility for running Marwan, never wavered from his belief that the angel had been loyal to the end. Others inside Israeli military intelligence, including senior officers who had lived through the war Marwan's warning was meant to prevent, never let go of the alternative. That disagreement had a name attached to it on the other side of the argument too. Eli Zira, who headed Israeli military intelligence during the war, became the most senior voice, arguing that Marwan had been exactly what the doubters feared, a source whose entire value had been engineered by people who understood Israeli intelligence culture well enough to exploit it from the inside. The argument did not stay contained to classified debriefings. It followed Marwan for the rest of his life, in the form of a suspicion he could never fully answer and a trust he could never fully secure. He had spent nearly 2 decades constructing an existence built entirely on being believed by people whose job was to disbelieve everyone. When the war ended, that construction did not collapse, but it never again stood as solidly as it had before the false alarms. The institutional cost ran just as deep, and it ran in a direction most accounts of the war rarely examine closely. Israeli intelligence emerged from 1973, having learned a lesson that would shape how it evaluated every high-value source that came after. That access, however extraordinary, cannot substitute for verification, and that the psychological comfort of a trusted informant can quietly become its own kind of vulnerability. The very qualities that made Marwan valuable, his proximity to power, his willingness to take enormous risk, his years of accurate reporting, were the same qualities that made the 2 years of doubt about him so difficult to resolve in time. Marwan returned to his life in London and Cairo the way he always had, moving between 2 worlds that each believed, with equal confidence and no final proof, that they understood exactly who he was. For nearly 3 decades, that ambiguity held. He built a business career, maintained his standing in Egyptian society, and carried a secret that only a handful of people on either side were fully positioned to evaluate. That hold began to break in 1999, when a historian named Aaron Bregman began investigating rumors that Israel's most important Yom Kippur war source had been a member of Egypt's presidential family. 3 years of careful research followed, built from documents, interviews, and a kind of patient cross-checking that eventually made denial harder to sustain than confirmation. When Bregman finally published his findings in 2002, naming Marwan as the angel, Marwan responded exactly as a man in his position had to respond. He called the claim a fabrication, dismissed it publicly, and treated the accusation with the same practiced composure that had carried him through 3 decades of performance. But denial only works when the story stays contested, and inside Israel's own intelligence establishment, the underlying argument over what Marwan actually was had never been settled in the first place. That unresolved fracture eventually reached a courtroom, when a legal dispute connected to Bregman's reporting required sworn testimony about Marwan's true role. In that arbitration, a judge reviewing the classified record concluded that Marwan had been loyal to Israel. The finding was meant to stay confidential. It did not. Word of the verdict leaked and began circulating publicly, reaching exactly the audience Marwan had spent his entire adult life avoiding. What happened next unfolded quickly. Marwan called Bregman in a state the historian had never heard from him before, leaving repeated messages, arranging an urgent meeting for the following day. He never arrived. That same morning, Marwan fell from the 5th floor balcony of his London apartment and died at the age of 63. No one was ever charged. No official explanation was ever confirmed. The circumstances were left exactly where the rest of his life had always sat, plausible in more than one direction, provable in none. What the operation cost in the end was not measured only in the war's casualties or in the strategic ground lost during those first chaotic hours. It was measured in a man who spent the better part of his adult life unable to fully belong to either side that claimed him, and in two intelligence services that, even decades later, could not agree on whether they had run the best asset of the century or been run by him instead. Egypt, for its part, never resolved the question publicly either. Even senior figures who might have known more chose ambiguity over clarity, praising Marwan in vague terms for service to his country while never specifying what that service actually was. A silence that protected Egypt from admitting infiltration at the highest level just as easily as it protected the possibility that Marwan had, in fact, been working for Cairo the entire time. Years later, an Egyptian intelligence officer who had led the very department responsible for watching for exactly this kind of threat gave a rare interview stating that Marwan had not been a double agent at all. Testimony that reopened the argument publicly rather than settling it, since it arrived from a source with every institutional reason to prefer one answer over the other. And more recently still, journalists working from newly surfaced material have argued the opposite case with equal conviction, presenting Marwan as the architect of Egypt's deception plan from the very beginning, a theory that treats his famous 14-hour warning not as loyalty under pressure, but as the final, most convincing move in an operation that had been running since 1970. Even the Mossad's own internal accounting of the case, compiled decades later to honor the memory of the man who ran him, has been read by outside historians as an argument written to reassure rather than to settle. A document that lays out the facts of Marwan's handling in careful, procedural language, while never quite closing the door the way it seems to want to. What Marwan lost, whichever version of him was real, was the one thing his entire life had been built to protect: a name that could stand in a single room under a single loyalty without a second meaning attached to it. He died without ever getting that back. This case did not exist in isolation. It sits inside a much older and colder tradition: the methodology of controlled betrayal, the deliberate cultivation of doubt inside an adversary's own trusted channels, used long before Marwan and refined long after him. The cases that built that doctrine are not sitting in any public archive. Some of them, along with the operational patterns behind them, are laid out in the ebook in the description below. It walks through how controlled betrayal operations are actually built and run, the recruitment signals, the false alarm techniques used to condition a target's trust, and the long-term costs those methods carry for the people who execute them. That's what we put together in the ebook, and it's linked in the description if you want to go through it. If you've made it this far, you already understand how difficult a case like this is to resolve with any certainty. Let us know in the comments which version of Ashraf Marwan you believe was real.